Greetings, everybody. Peter Maravellis here. Welcome to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as San Francisco, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums, moving towards the winter solstice and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. Tonight, we are deeply honored to have with us an author whose work has had a profound effect on many of us at City Lights, and indeed readers the world over. His complex novels probe the nature of identity, whether it be personal or national, giving us insights into the human condition in relation to place and the movement of history. It is a great pleasure to be able to welcome Amitav Ghosh with us tonight. He is the author of numerous books of fiction and nonfiction. His fiction titles include such books as The Circle of Reason, The Shadow Lines, Gun Island, also the celebrated Ibis trilogy of books. His nonfiction includes such titles as In an Antique Land, The Imam and the Indian, and very recently, The Great Derangement, Climate Change, and the Unthinkable. Mr. Ghosh has received numerous honors for his work. These include the 54th Jnanpith Award, India's highest literary honor, also the Prix Médicis Étrangers, one of France's top literary awards. This amongst many, many other awards, 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards, 4 honorary doctorates, amongst many, many others. So tonight we are celebrating his latest book. It is titled The Nutmegs Curse, Parables for a Planet in Crisis. In it, Mr. Ghosh follows the journey of nutmeg from the Banda Islands to many other parts of the world, examining the historical influence of colonialism, and also locating the origins of our contemporary climate crisis in Western colonialism's violent exploitation of human life and the natural environment. Joining Mr. Ghosh in conversation this evening is Raj Patel. He is a research professor at the University of Texas at Austin's Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, a professor in the university's Department of Nutrition, and a research associate at Rhodes University in South Africa. He is the author of Stuffed and Starved, also the New York Times bestselling The Value of Nothing, and co-author of A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. His most recent book is co-authored with Rupa Maria and is entitled Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. A James Beard Leadership Award winner, he's completing a film on the global food system. He serves on the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and has advised governments on causes and solutions in the crisis of sustainability worldwide. Everyone, please join us now in giving a warm welcome to our guests. It is a great honor to have you both with us. Amitav Ghosh, Raj Patel, welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you very much indeed. Amitav, I have the great privilege of being in conversation with you. I believe, I mean, technically it's Dr. Ghosh and Professor Ghosh, because and people don't know this, but you do have a doctorate that wasn't bestowed but earned in anthropology, as well as now being a professor of comparative literature and having a cabinet full of awards. But Amitav is what I'll use if you don't mind. Let's talk about this book, which if you, there we are, thank you. There is a link to purchase this right now in the chat. And indeed, if you've got questions, please do put them in the chat. My job in part is to stand and filter those questions for Amitav later on. But first we get to have a little bit of conversation about this magical book. I mean, look, people have called it timely, they've called it compelling, a tour de force, and all the superlatives don't quite make it easy to describe. I mean, it's a non-fiction essay about so many things. And for me, I feel like it's a ghost story for climate change. And so I wonder, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about ghosts. And I wonder if we can begin with the most boring question, but I promise we'll get better from here. What is the Nutmegs Curse?
Well, let me say, first of all, what a pleasure it is to be doing this at City Lights. I wish it were in person, but of course, that's become increasingly impossible. I've loved doing events there, done many in the past, so it's great to be back. And it's great to be back, especially with you, Raj, because I feel that this is just a part of an ongoing conversation that we've been having for years and years. And I should add here that there are 2 books here that we're really talking about today. One is mine, which is, of course, The Nutmegs Curse, and the other is yours, Inflamed, which reached me just as I was finishing the Nutmegs Curse. And the extraordinary thing is that, there were so many sorts of parallels in our ways of thinking and what we were reading, in so many themes that you touched upon, even though you and Rupa Maria were coming at it from medicine and I was coming at it from a completely different direction. So there were so many overlaps, it was really quite uncanny. And of course, the uncanny is what you're asking me about now, which is the whole sort of domain of the spectral and the ways in which we are haunted by the past. And I certainly think that, when we look at this climate crisis, I think one of the, or rather, let me say the planetary crisis, because it's not just the climate crisis. I mean, as Margaret Atwood famously said, it's not just climate change, it's everything change. And, that is exactly what it is. And really what we see within this planetary crisis, when it's discussed, especially in the Western discourse, it's always presented as a problem about the future, about an issue of science and technology. Whereas I think to many of us, it's very clear that in fact, this is a legacy of history. It's what's come down to us from the past. We are absolutely haunted by our past. And I think this is perhaps more true of North America than of any other place.
But I mean, I'm going to double down on this question though. Why the Nutmegs Curse? What is it? I mean, about this, about these islands, about this spice that caught your eye initially?
Well, Raj, it's very interesting. After all, you've been writing about food for a very long time. And you know that now we just take food for granted. It's just treated as a part of a sort of industrial system, which everyone just shrugs off. And we tend to forget the sort of deep histories, of food, of drink, of whatever. But the reason why the nutmeg, I framed this book around the history of the nutmeg is because I think that history tells us a lot about the world that we live in today. So, I mean, just to put it very briefly, the nutmeg was this incredible tree which provided not just the nutmeg, but also mace. Mace is the sort of filmy outer covering of the nutmeg fruit. Now, the nutmeg had really conquered the world long before the Common Era. It was circulating very widely in Europe, in China, in India, across Eurasia, across Africa. And the extraordinary thing is that this tree grew only in one place on Earth, which is this tiny archipelago called the Banda Islands, a very remote place by any reckoning. It's in the very far east of Indonesia, a part of what is now called the Moluccas or the Spice Islands. In Indonesian, they're known as Maluku. And the place that's closest to the Banda Islands, perhaps, is Timor. So it's really far out. I mean, it's absolutely in the middle of nowhere. And it's just, I mean, these 5 or 6 islands, they're just the remains of an extinct volcano. The volcano isn't extinct, actually. I mean, it's still actually firing on all cylinders and has been for a long time. But it's exploded many times in recorded human history. So it's just this tiny group of islands, the largest of which is not even 2 or 3 miles long. So these islands produced all the world's nutmeg before the 18th century. And, because nutmegs became incredibly valuable in Europe in the late medieval period. That was one of the reasons why the navigators set off on their long journeys into the Indian Ocean and across the Indian Ocean to Maluku. One of the first places they made for was the Banda Islands. The Portuguese reached the Banda Islands in 1511, and from that time on, many groups of Europeans, Portuguese, Spanish, English, Dutch, visited the Banda Islands with the sole purpose of trying to impose a monopoly on the nutmeg trade. Now, the Banda Islanders naturally resisted this monopoly. But finally, in 1621, the Dutch had a governor general in the East Indies called Jan Pietersen Koen. And Jan Pietersen Koen decided to implement a final solution. So he led he led a fleet to the to the Banda Islands, and essentially in a period of a few weeks, they completely massacred and eliminated all the islanders. They killed many. Many were driven into the mountains in these islands where they perished of starvation and disease, and many were enslaved and taken off to other islands. A certain number of islanders, a few hundred, there were only about 15,000 islanders anyway, but a few hundred escaped, and they've kept Bandanese culture alive on other nearby islands. But I mean, it's just the most horrifying story, really. So the what happened in the Banda Islands is that these islanders who actually had this incredible tree gifted to them by their volcanic ecology. This tree was literally a tree of life which sustained them for generations, made them rich and prosperous. This tree ultimately became also a tree of death, which killed them. So I think in many ways we can look at the world today through a similar lens. Because what the Bandanese suffered, they were one of the first groups to suffer from the resource curse. And the resource curse has repeatedly come down on country after country because they've been blessed with something or the other that comes from the earth. And now the resource curse has been generalized to the entire planet. And I think in many ways we could say that really it's the climate crisis or the planetary crisis is an aspect of a resource curse which has become globalized.
Well, so this language of being blessed by a resource that then turns into a curse, and then towards the end of the book, I'm not giving anything away here. I mean, you visit the site of this massacre and talk about your sense of the ghosts who are around. And I wonder whether we can tie that just to the way you begin the book. So you end the book surrounded by ghosts of the Nutmegs Curse, but you begin the book also surrounded by a curse of a kind. I mean, you start this book both talking about the history of nutmeg, but also situating yourself in the middle of the pandemic, surrounded by the sirens that that sort of echoed through the streets of New York. And I wonder if you can just talk to us a little bit about the sort of dual. The sort of dual presence of ghosts from Brooklyn to the Banda Islands as you were writing this book, and maybe just share a little bit about how one set of sort of sounds and spectral presences affected your understanding of the other.
Well, this book, I started writing it on about the 8th of March, 2020. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, I'd been working on another project before that, and I finished it. And exactly then, about the 8th of March, I started working on this book. And it was such a strange thing because I was in my house in Brooklyn, where I'm sitting right now. And it's a very old house. It goes back to the mid 19th century, in fact. And it was a very strange thing. I mean, the whole city shut down. But Brooklyn especially became really silent. I mean, unlike Manhattan, Brooklyn is usually pretty quiet. But then it just became this eerie silence, which would be broken only by the sound of these ambulances racing down the streets. Not far from my house is a hospital, which had all these rows of refrigerated trucks outside, that were stacking up the bodies. So it was a very strange thing. I was writing, in a sense, about this very faraway place, but I was also writing a journal of the plague year, which also happened, not so far, not so long distant from the time of the Banda massacres, So yes, it was a weird and uncanny thing that I became completely focused on the story, on finding the sources for this story. And actually, it was a very weird thing that this this virus operating on a planetary scale. And the internet actually made it possible for me to dig out this, elements of this story, because I found Dutch sources and I started, I don't know Dutch, but through one of these internet translation apps, I started translating 17th century sources into English, trying to make sense of them, trying to make sense of what had happened in the Banda Islands.
No, but you were also surrounded, as you say, by the ghosts of a previous project. I mean, in Gun Island, you've done a lot of research around climate migrants, and I mean, in part, this this book is a requiem for those for climate migrants, which is the term that we use, but which they themselves may not. But the idea of again the ghosts of the people who perish in the Mediterranean, driven in part by climate change, who may not choose to name that as the first reason why it is that they're crossing the Mediterranean, but where you're engaged in an investigation to understand. Well, all right. I mean, and this is your anthropological training coming to the fore here, and you can read it. I mean, again, everyone here needs to buy this book, not least because this is fantastic anthropology. But you see it in the ways that you're holding these interviews and holding the space for folks to be able to explore reasons for why it is that they find themselves where they are. And I wonder if how those ghosts haunted you while you were writing this book, and how those ghosts from a previous project continued to sit on your shoulders.
It's very interesting that you say that, Raj, because actually, because the rapportage on these subjects is produced really largely by Western reporters who are very much within a certain kind of, how should I say, sort of very empirical sort of mindset. They miss so much about these massive movements of people, and actually elements of the uncanny play such a large part in these movements, which is almost never talked about. For example, a lot of the Nigerians who leave Nigeria, and Nigerians are one of the largest groups migrating across the Mediterranean. They actually have all these sorts of rituals that precede the migration. They get tied to certain spirit forms. When they end up inside Europe, they have psychological issues which are actually very much tied to elements of the uncanny. There's a researcher in Turin. He actually runs the Franz Fanon Center in Turin. He's a completely brilliant man. His name is Roberto Beneduce. And he's done really fascinating research on this. I mean, how a lot of the women come to be haunted, how they feel that, they have these spirit husbands who come to haunt them. There are all these elements of the uncanny, and it happens, even when you talk to the migrants, they mention these things all the time, all these elements of the uncanny that accompany these movements. Because, it's become like a convention for people like us, when we talk about these things, to always present it within a certain framework of a certain kind of instrumental rationality. But what is at work here? And again, let's emphasize that the people who are actually migrating across borders on across long distances are a tiny minority. They're not even like a 0.3% of the population. But when you look at the extent of the population, 0.3% becomes a large number. But a lot of the motivations that go into these movements are not in any real sense explicable as completely rational or completely means end oriented or anything like that. There's a really wonderful episode on NPR, which is about a migrant from Cameroon who ends up around Melilla. Melilla is one of those towns. It's a Spanish town in North Africa, in Morocco, and he ends up and Melilla and Ceuta, these two Spanish enclaves in Morocco, surrounded by these massive walls and huge numbers of armed guards and all kinds of things, because if you can get into Melilla or Ceuta, you're essentially on European territory. So large numbers of people from all across Africa and even from Asia besiege these two towns, and repeatedly throw themselves at these walls. And on this NPR show, they talk to a young Cameroonian who finally makes it across at great cost to himself after 3 years of, throwing himself repeatedly at this barrier. And they ask him, why did you do it? What was so important? And he said, there was no reason except that it was there. He said, this fence is not a real fence. It's a spirit being. It has a spirit inside it. That's what draws us on. And, that's the uncanny element to this, because, without hearing exactly that term, one hears very similar things often from these migrants. I mean, that essentially the reason why they want to go to Europe is not, it's not rational. The reason they do it is because it's there. And, if you and I had been in their circumstances, we would have done exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
When you're 18 or 19 or 20, you don't have a rational calculus of risk. You do certain things simply because it can be done or because it's a challenge, and danger is not a disincentive. Danger is in fact an incentive. This is what people don't understand. After all, why do Westerners go off to climb these impossible mountains? And climbing those mountains is the stupidest possible thing you can think of. Those mountains have been climbed by thousands of people. I mean, one Nepali guy jumped up and down those mountains, 14 peaks in like 1 month. I mean, what is left? Why is this important for you? So in that similar vein, if you're presented with another challenge like that, of course you're going to do it.
Well, that's it. I mean, but one group of people get features on National Geographic and the other get features on Fox, and they are not the same. But that points to how it is that your history in this book is not only a story about ghosts, but it's also a very material story. And you talk about the sort of forces that drive people, not just along the spice route, but today as a kind of, through the lens of colonialism, as a kind of terraforming. And this is of the moment because, we've just learned that Times Person of the Year is someone who's very excited about terraforming. Elon Musk wants to terraform Mars and is very interested in space colonization, and just so that we can take a glimpse into the future. I mean, your other work, particularly in The Great Derangement, calls for a certain kind of climate science fiction, and we don't even have to wish for that now because Elon Musk is already painting that for us. And so you give us the resources in this book to be able to understand what's coming as terraforming. And I wonder if you can just talk to us a little bit about the sort of spiritualism of terraforming and why terraforming is colonialism. I mean, why colonialism is also a spiritual activity as well as a very material one.
I don't know that I would call it a spiritual activity, but it's certainly, terraforming is absolutely a fundamental aspect of settler colonialism. The settler colonials who came to North America, especially in the 17th century, they said quite explicitly that they found this landscape horrible, ugly, uncanny, unpleasant, especially the landscapes around Connecticut and northern New England was swampy, forested, etc. And their aim was to remake this landscape in the image of England. And they succeeded. I mean, they succeeded at an astonishingly fast clip. And they succeeded, of course, at the expense of Native Americans. They completely transformed this landscape. They literally terraformed it and turned it into something that it was not. And they did this continuously across North America. So California is perhaps the most intensively terraformed part of North America. Similarly, British Columbia, the West Coast, and so on. So if you look at what Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and so on want to do, it's almost like an infantile reversion to a certain settler colonial imaginary. They want to relive the lives of their ancestors, where they think they want to go off to some empty planet and change it into something habitable. But there itself, you find the erasure of history, because of course, North America was anything but empty. There were tens of millions of Native Americans living here, whom they essentially, large numbers, were exterminated in these processes of terraforming. And in that sense, terraforming was a process of biological warfare, where they unleashed certain forms of disease, where they used livestock, animals, their sort of their allies, to change the landscape beyond recognition. So really what you see with Elon Musk and so on, what can you say? It's the complete derangement of the settler colonial mindset now manifesting itself in this way. But even as I say that, I really should emphasize also that, there's a strange paradox at the heart of the settler colonial project, which is that today, about half of North Americans perhaps, want to double down on the settler colonial project. But I would say about half, on the other hand, have actually in many ways been indigenized. That they have actually come to accept certain kinds of indigenous culture very much into their lives, into their ways of thought. And I think we've seen this repeatedly, especially over the last 10 or 15 years. The ways in which the Occupy movement expressed itself, the ways in which the No DAPL movement worked out, and again also with the Black Lives Matter movement. So I do think that there are two contradictory impulses at the heart of the old settler colonies. The sad thing is that today countries like India, Indonesia, and China have essentially completely adopted the settler colonial project in relation to their own landscapes and their own indigenous peoples.
Well, that's where I'm hoping that we might be able to return to the sort of intersection between the spiritual world and the physical world. And I wonder if you might be able to tell us a little bit about Kopenawa. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But talk to us about him and his spiritual journey and physical journey between colonized and decolonized, because it seems that that's something that speaks to this moment and speaks to a sort of fragment of hope as a way of escaping this curse.
Well, a large part of my book is really about notions of vitalism, which are that humans are not the only ensouled beings on the planet, that many other kinds of beings have souls, have volition, have agency, and have communicative abilities and so on. And these ideas were very widely shared across humanity, even in the West. I mean, peasants and so on to this day, in rural Italy or rural France or Ireland, where they believe in the little people, and in Norway and so on. There's a very powerful belief that there are many kinds of intelligences in the world around us. These ideas came to be suppressed essentially after the 17th century, after the so-called Enlightenment, and which produced this idea of a mechanical earth, which was dead. It was inert, the earth was dead, all things were dead, animals were robots, and humans were the only ones with reason or with agency. And I think this idea, which was propagated, of course, by elite European men, very much grew out of the European experience of colonizing the Americas, because out of the incredible, indeed unprecedented violence of that period, you get these ideas. I mean, in fact, the massacre of the Bandanese, I think, would not have been conceivable if similar things had not been happening in America at that time. So I think these ideas of what should we call it, a sort of mechanical earth or a clockwork earth, have today been completely repudiated, not by intellectuals, because actually most intellectuals don't have the courage to say what they're seeing around them. But James Lovelock did have that courage, and he did say that, the earth has been shown to be a living entity, an entity with its own volition. And we see that now in relation to so many things. So how do we get back? How do we, you and I and so many of us here who've been educated in a certain way, to think of the earth as dead? I mean, that's what the process of education has been, Western education for the last 200 years. In the Americas, they took this so seriously that they imprisoned Native American children, to make them learn that that essentially the earth is dead. Because if you didn't believe that, you were wild, you were a savage. So how do we get back into trying to understand these vitalist ideas? And I do think that really we have to go back and to try and read and understand people who apprehend this vitalism at first hand. Because of course, even to apprehend that vitalism, you have to go through a very rigorous process of training. And Davi Kopenawa is a Yanomami shaman. He and his collaborator, Bruce Albert, have written an absolutely astonishing book called The Falling Sky. It's a kind of autobiography of Davi Kopenawa, who's become actually a very important environmental activist in Amazonia. And I do urge people to read it. It's a very, very important book. And I think only by reading those things can we even begin to try and understand, other ways of imagining the earth.
Well, and I mean, it's central to Kopenawa's technique of shamanism is to try to become a ghost. And I mean, I think that again, I'm banging on my theory here that this is in fact a ghost story. But I mean, the solution is that while settler colonialism and capitalism has created these institutions that are fundamentally about a dead earth and automata that we can exploit one way or another. The only place in which there can be a sort of true equality is where everything is a ghost, humans and the rest of the web of life alike. And I found your discussion about the possibilities of being a ghost liberating. Under a certain aspect, it's possible for for us all to find equality, not in the material world, but in the uncanny one. And I'm wondering if you've got sort of reflections on that in this sort of moment where we're starting to name our ghosts after the letters of the Greek alphabet. Obviously, we're skipping over Psi and Nu for various reasons, but I mean, I wonder if there is a way of talking about this, the ghostly world that helps us find equality.
Well, look, the very word ghost is in some sense problematic because even within the Catholic Church, they no longer speak of the Holy Ghost, but of the Holy Spirit. And in fact, Davi Kopenawa, his argument is that the world is composed of, that all things have spirit. Whether it's the forest or whether it's trees or whether it's animals. And that in fact, humans differ from animals and so on, only in shape, only in form. In spirit, they're the same. So their spirits can converse. And the whole business of shamanic training is precisely to allow these spirits to converse. But again, we have to accept that that kind of ability is not for everyone. I mean, Davi Kopenawa knew very early that he had these abilities, just as, we all know people who have these abilities. I mean, I don't know if you saw that very good article in The Atlantic about a woman who could communicate with crows. We can't all do that, but we all know people who have special abilities in relation to animals. I mean, I'm sure we all know the little old lady who says that she can talk to a cat. and we laugh at her, but maybe she can. I mean, I certainly have a relative who can make the cat go outside, into the rain, which the cat obviously doesn't want to do.
Yeah.
So, people have very different abilities. And why should that surprise us? I mean, we know that some people have uncanny abilities at mathematics or physics or stuff like that, or some people are incredibly good at all sorts of athletic feats, which are not just feats of the body, but also feats of the mind. So why should we not accept that, there are some humans who also have these other completely uncanny abilities? So I don't think it's ever going to be a situation of equality, that we are not all of us going to be able to have these abilities. But I think we must open our minds to the idea that some humans do have these abilities, which we actually know from history. I mean, forget the Indian tradition or whatever. Saint Francis of Assisi, he was very famously someone who could communicate with animals. And there have been many testimonies about his ability to communicate with animals. And it's very interesting, I think, that the present Pope named himself after Saint Francis. So within every tradition, this exists.
Audience, we've got about 20 minutes left, and I'm keen to make sure that we have time for your questions to Amitav, so do put them in the chat. But Amitav, look, we've got this situation where clearly there are people who are able to help reconnect us to the web of life, and yet insofar as colonial capitalism has an MO, it is to encourage us to forget that those people need to be taken seriously, and in fact, occasionally to burn those people at the stake for what it is that they represent in opposition. And you cover that very beautifully in the book. So how is it that we can unlearn what it is that every day we are told, no, we need to musk up here and just get in our Teslas, drive to the space, whatever it is, spaceport here in Texas, and jump on a rocket and head off into space? I mean, how is it that we can unlearn the more subtle elements of this curse? And what is that process of recognition and of unlearning what it is that the past 600 years has set up institutions to teach us?
Well, Raj, very simply, I think you've provided the answer in your book, which is we have to have different stories. And can I just read just 2 lines?
Honestly, this wasn't a setup.
Yet colonialism requires that the landscape be denuded both of its stories and of their tellers. And I think you're absolutely right there. So that is the pressing duty that is upon us now, those of us who write and tell stories, that we have to find these other stories. We have to restore these other stories to their proper place.
Where do you go to find new stories? I mean, one of the joys of reading your book was just to see how beautifully widely read you are. I mean, I don't know how you fit it all in, but clearly you do. And you've got a memory that can pull all this stuff in. Where do you go for new inspiration to be able to find the stories that the canon has left you ill-prepared to seek out?
I guess I've always read a lot. I mean, since I was a kid, I was a kind of a bookworm. So I just read and read and read. And especially during this pandemic, my goodness, I was reading 2 books a day while I was writing this book as well. So, it just provided this incredible focus where I could really just concentrate on the reading and the writing.
And again, short of perusing the shelves of City Lights, I mean, is there a heuristic that you would recommend other people to follow? Because otherwise, we'll just have people reading Sally Rooney over and over again. Not that I've got anything against Sally Rooney. I mean, but there are paths that lead into new spaces and paths that just deepen our understandings of the ones we find ourselves in. How do you? How do you break the habits of your reading in ways that open you up to the world in new ways?
Yeah, it's very difficult because we've all been held in a sort of state of terror by what you might call a certain kind of modernist vision of the world. But I think we're all also right at this moment. One of the great things about climate change is that it's also a great teacher. I mean, it's really been showing us that everything that we know is wrong. And that even the sciences are just about good enough now to tell us where we were wrong. But they themselves are continuously wrong because they're underestimating the rate of change. I mean, one of the commonest phrases that one sees now in the headlines is "scientists are shocked." Or you see it all the time. I'm not surprised. I mean, I expected that it would happen in, as they say, non-linear ways. But it's an interesting thing to see. But there are one of the strange aspects of writing this book is that so many other books were coming out just around then. That was so much on similar lines, where the reading was shared, the ideas were shared. So it was true of your book, Inflamed. It was also true of a wonderful book that I read called Desert Notebooks by Ben Ehrenreich. A completely wonderful book.
Beautiful book, yeah.
Yeah, and Ben and I now call ourselves, we're the League of Tough-Minded Animists. So maybe that's a way to go.
But so here's the thing: if you're, I mean, it is a standard refrain. Yes, climate scientists are shocked. What are you shocked by? Well, I mean, in the process of this book, what took your breath away?
I think what shocks me increasingly is actually how fragile human society is, how fragile a civilization is, how much more fragile than we expected. And in fact, the fragility is manifested precisely among those who feel that they are not fragile. So the affluent countries have proven to be, as we see through this pandemic, actually much more vulnerable and much more fragile than many so-called underdeveloped countries. So development is itself, the so-called development is itself a sort of an accelerator of fragility.
Well, I love this idea of the global South teaching the global North a lesson or two. I mean, we can see it in a range of countries, and particularly a range of indigenous communities where zero COVID is still just something that is the case, while the rest of the sort of state capitalist infrastructure burns. But that also cracks open the possibility of other kinds of government and other kinds of ways of being. And so we've got a question from Charlie here about Kim Stanley Robinson's work. And I don't know if you've had a chance to read the Ministry of the Future or any of his other climate work, but I'm wondering if you've had a chance to engage with his work and what you think of it.
I have to say that work that projects into the future is really just not of that much interest to me. I just don't find it that interesting, because it seems to me that the ways in which things are unfolding around us right now is much more interesting and much more engaging. And it strikes me as very strange that people want to project into the future when we have shown ourselves to be so incapable of dealing with the present. You just look, there are books about the future drowning of New York at 10 a penny. There are so many of them. And yet when New York was actually drowned in 2012, Hurricane Sandy, that's hardly been written about at all. Can you think of a single story or a single novel about that? So I do feel that this business of projecting into the future, to me, is a sign of it's a symptom of the same phenomenon that's actually driving us crazy.
Well, so one of the stories in I'm going to press you on this on Kim Stanley Robinson's work, just because it's about India, and Rather famously, the Ministry of the Future opens with a story about how in India there's going to be, and I mean, this isn't science fiction really, this is just science, moments in the near future of India where people die of excessive heat. And already, you see in Delhi, for example, people dying of just straight pollution and particulate matter, and not just dying from asthma, but suffering everything from heart attacks to Alzheimer's, all the things that we associate with PM 2.5 pollution. But in Kim Stanley Robinson's book, and I'm just taking Charlie's invitation here to opine a second, there's a moment where the Indian government recognizes that it must swing into action and becomes a world leader on the stage. And I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about how likely it is that this particular Indian government is going to do anything that approaches what is required for the majority of Indian citizens when it comes to things like climate change and the transformative politics that are clearly required in this moment.
You're pushing me into...
Oh yeah, no, you're going to get trolled on Twitter anyway.
But look, I think this really embodies one of the worst impulses of Western science fiction, which is always to externalize these problems onto Black and brown people. In the first place, there have been terrible heat waves in India, but the scale of death is nowhere close to the scale of death that happened in Europe in 2005 during the heat waves, or in Russia during the heat waves. In Europe, during one of these heat waves, 70,000 people died. Nowhere in India has it ever been suggested that people died on the same scale. Secondly, the idea that the Indian government or that any Indian group would intervene by doing geoengineering is completely absurd. Because everybody knows that most of these geoengineering interventions would be catastrophic for the global South. It would be catastrophic for India, because it would disrupt the monsoons. We also know that the people who are preparing to actually do geoengineering are billionaires in the West. Right. The biggest investor in geoengineering is Bill Gates. And he and elite institutions in America, like Harvard and Yale, have been talking of geoengineering on a massive scale. And actually, they're going to do it. We know it. Because this is a cheap technology that any billionaire can go out there and do. So the real question, which actually is so completely elided by this kind of science fictional imagining, is what will India and China do to stop those billionaires? I mean, imagine if one of those billionaires were to send out a ship that was going to blast a sulfuric acid. I've heard these Harvard so-called experts holding forth on geoengineering, and one of them said, "Oh, we'll just shoot some sulfuric acid into the outer atmosphere." Yeah, what could go wrong? I mean, the whole history of technology is one of disastrous unintended consequences. And this is what strikes me as so, how shall I say? I just don't know how else to put it. This is just a displacement of anxieties which Westerners have done for centuries by foisting them on Black and brown people. Their problem is at home. Let them write about what's going on in their homes. They know nothing about India. They don't know. I've never met any Indian or anyone in the global South who has any conception of geoengineering, far from having the technical ability to do it. These are the ways in which this kind of science fictional imagining actually creates a problem by displacing these issues onto, literally onto the other.
No, that's it. I mean, it was galling to see after COP26 was predictably shit and ended in disaster, that there was a columnist in the Financial Times just sort of sadly shrugging his shoulders, saying, well, this just says that increasingly geoengineering, alas, is just going to become more likely. And admitting that the problem of geoengineering is not that it is batshit crazy, but it is so cheap, and that it is well within the grasp of whatever person of the year you would care to name, to basically just send up a rocket or two and spray the atmosphere as an act of selflessness and piety, so that their particular bit of New Zealand was well covered and taken care of. Now we have one last question. Sorry, go on.
They know perfectly well that the people who will pay the price are black and brown people. That's the unwritten subtext. That's why I'm with it.
No, we've got a final question here on language. What's the difference between settler colonial capitalism and development, which is desired by the vast majority of people around the world as a way out of poverty?
Well, the first question that it begs is, what is poverty? Is not having two cars poverty? In which case, of course, the great majority of the world, going back to ancient times, has always been poor. These measures of poverty are themselves so ridiculous. I don't know if you guys have read The Dawn of Everything, but that's another book which you really must read, because it really blows up the ground under these things. I mean, how do you judge poverty? I mean, are you these economists are actually so, what can you say? You can't even call them blind, the people who draw up these metrics of poverty and affluence and so on, because are you assigning a price to the fact that those people in the jungle have clean air, that they spend time with their children, that they actually devote themselves to the education of their children, to bringing up their families, their communities? What are the prices that you put on that? Where is this? I mean, how do you judge that this is that's something that you define as not poverty, that is having 2 fridges in your house? I mean, that is wealth. Where do you get this perverse idea of human life?
And I love that you mentioned The Dawn of Everything, because it also helps just deconstruct the question of, well, what do you want? Communism, or pointing to Eastern Europe, for example, as the alternative, when Eastern Europe was neither communist nor particularly desirable, and that there are, it's not just Coke or Pepsi when it comes to possible regimes of human being or modes of existence, but that the great joy of The Dawn of Everything is that it points out that human civilizations used to have different kinds of modes of government, even according to the season, depending on which part of the harvest you were in, and that, I think, breaks open our imaginations for what is possible in some very exciting ways. And so as we come to an end here, Amitav, and respectful of your time and the fact that we're keeping up way late, the final question we've got is from Turquoise, who asks, can you talk to us about your writing process? And I'm just going to add as a coda, what's next?
Well, my writing process is pretty boring. I get up in the morning, go to my desk, I write for a long time, taking little breaks for tea and for lunch, and I just write through the day. That's all I do. That's all I've done for decades. So what else can I say? And yes, I'm now struggling with a book which is actually along quite similar lines, and lines that you'll appreciate with your work on food and so on. It's actually about the part that opium played in creating the modern world.
Fantastic. Oh, wonderful. And while you wait, the Ibis trilogy is right there, and y'all should have that on your shelves, and also read it, in addition to reading The Nutmegs Curse. Comrades, thank you. And Inflamed by Rupa Maria, Raj Patel. And comrades, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you so much, Amitav, for this amazing conversation. And it's good to see so many fantastic friends and comrades in the audience. And thank you for so many terrific questions. And over to you, Peter, to take us home.
Well, thank you both. I mean, this has been such a very deep discussion. Thank you, Amitav Ghosh. This has been an honor having you grace our virtual halls. Raj, thank you for doing the honors. And next time, we hope to be able to do this in store. I really, really hope.
Thank you so much for having me.